The shocking case of the family that committed the worst kind of incest, between parents and children. They said it was just another remote settlement, tucked away in the forgotten folds of Appalachia. A place where the roads end in dirt and the mail hasn't come in years. But what one volunteer discovered, there was something far worse than poverty or isolation. It was a silence so thick it swallowed names, erased birthdays, and blurred the lines between parent and child, brother and father, mother and wife. Behind rotting wooden walls and cracked window panes lay a family that no longer knew where the bloodline ended or began. And when a little girl looked up and asked a stranger, "Are you my uncle too?" something irreversible was set in motion. I'm Berg, and this is Deep American Shadows. If you haven't subscribed yet, I invite you to do it now. This channel isn't about legends or ghost stories. We talk about the things that sit in the dark corners of this country, the places no one wants to look, and the truths that never made it into headlines. If you're ready to follow this story to the end, hit that bell and stay with me. It started with a detour. Ethan Walker, a young nurse volunteering with a rural medical outreach program, was driving through eastern Kentucky when a mudslide blocked the main road. GPS was useless that far into the mountains, so he followed a rough gravel path barely wide enough for one car. The sun was starting to dip behind the hills when he reached a clearing where 8 or 9 small structures stood, barely upright, patched with metal scraps and faded tarps. No power lines, no sound, no movement, until a child stepped out from behind a slanted door. She was barefoot, no older than 6 or 7, with a tattered gray shirt hanging off one shoulder and hair so matted it looked like a nest. She didn't speak at first, just stared. When Ethan cautiously waved and asked if her parents were home, the girl tilted her head and said, "Are you my uncle too?" Not with fear. Not with curiosity. Just a tired kind of familiarity. Ethan froze. Before he could respond, a woman emerged from the shadows of the doorway. Her face was deeply lined, her eyes dull. She told him, in a voice flat and expressionless, that they didn't need medicine, that he should leave. As he turned to go, he caught a glimpse through the door. A man, older, slack-jawed, pants unzipped, staring at nothing. Next to him, a teenage girl holding a toddler with unsettling stillness. Ethan got in his car and didn't look back until he reached the next town. But he couldn't shake it. The girl's question haunted him. So he filed a quiet report to the local Child Protective Services. They didn't follow up. Said it was likely a religious commune or an off-grid family. Nothing actionable. Ethan tried again, calling the county office. They shrugged it off. Said if no one was in immediate danger, there wasn't much they could do. He was told more than once to let it go. He didn't. Ethan contacted Margaret Maggie Hayes, a retired nurse known in those parts for her work in underserved rural areas. When he told her what he saw, she didn't act shocked. She went quiet. Then she asked where exactly he'd been. When he told her, she nodded slowly and said she'd heard rumors years ago about a family living beyond the ridge, as they used to call it. Something about cousins who ran off together decades ago, chased out of their hometown for trying to marry. She remembered hearing that no one had seen them since. 1 week later, Maggie and Ethan went back. Not as healthcare providers, but as witnesses. They drove the same path, this time bringing food, blankets, some old clothes, and a few toys. It was a pretext. They just wanted a reason to be let in. The community, if you could call it that, was unchanged. The same slouching houses, the same eerie silence. But this time people watched them. Faces behind sheets used as curtains. Children peeking through gaps in the walls. A small boy ran out from one of the houses and shouted something unintelligible before being yanked back inside by a woman with sunken cheeks and distant eyes. Maggie raised her hands in peace and said they were just there to help. The woman said they didn't need anything from outsiders. That their family was complete. That everything they had, they built themselves. But her voice trembled. Then a man appeared. Thin, gaunt, taller than he should have been for how hunched he stood. His arms dangled at his sides like forgotten tools, and he muttered to himself in slow, broken syllables. A girl walked behind him, clearly pregnant, guiding him with a rope tied to his wrist. Maggie's voice cracked as she whispered to Ethan that this wasn't just poverty, it was something deeper. Something older. The children didn't know their own names. One girl, when asked her age, said, "Mama says I was born after the big thunder." They had no documents. Couldn't read or write. And the family structure was incomprehensible. A woman said her brother was also her husband. A boy said his grandmother was also his mom. There were no boundaries. No clarity. Just generations melting into each other. That night, Maggie wrote everything she could remember in a spiral notebook. She sketched faces, recorded conversations from memory, and tried to map out the web of relationships, or what passed for them. Ethan, hands shaking, managed to take some photographs, but many were blurry. Still, they had enough to know what they were seeing wasn't just disturbing, it was a systemic failure. And it was buried in the woods, hidden behind silence and rotting timber. They visited again days later, bringing toys and books. A Bible. So, Maggie said they came to help, and this time some of the women listened. A girl emerged again, the one who had first spoken to Ethan. She wore the same shirt. Her feet were still bare. But this time she offered a hint of a smile. Maggie crouched and asked her name. The girl replied, barely audible, "Sometimes they call me Mary. But not always." The answer sliced through Maggie's heart. Identity had no permanence there. No birth certificates. No birthdays. Names were passed around like hand-me-downs. Inside one of the houses, Ethan found a child lying on a moldy mattress, unmoving. His skin was pale, lips blue. A woman stood nearby, saying something over and over, something that didn't make sense. Maggie rushed in with her medical kit, tried CPR, tried everything she could remember, but it was too late. The child died in her arms. The mother didn't cry, just stood there vacant. Later, when Maggie asked where they would bury him, no one answered clearly. Some said in the hole, others with the others. Maggie insisted on seeing. What she found was a shallow trench behind one of the shacks, covered in sticks and loose stones. She removed one, then another. Small bones. Cloth scraps. No headstones. No names. She stumbled away and vomited. Ethan said they had to go. That this was enough. That if they stayed longer it could become dangerous. But Maggie, wiping her mouth, said they couldn't leave now. Not when no one else would come. Not when the only people who knew this place even existed were standing right there. They stayed one more night. And that was when everything changed. A teenage boy, tall and bony, approached them quietly before dusk. His eyes were glassy, his speech slow. He handed Maggie a crumpled piece of paper and said he found it in an old box. It was a letter, faded and water-damaged. The handwriting was uneven. Read, "If anyone finds this, know we are not monsters. We were forgotten. My parents were cousins. So were theirs. No one ever came for us. Now we don't know who we are anymore." On the back, a photo, black and white, frayed edges, showed a young couple with a baby in their arms. A date scribbled faintly, 1954. Maggie sat down slowly, staring at it. Ethan didn't speak. The air was too thick with grief, confusion, and something neither of them could name. That night, as the air turned cold and the forest hushed around them, Maggie made a decision. They would take the girl. Not steal her. Not abduct. But offer her a way out. A choice. When she asked if the girl wanted to see a different place, a place with books and other kids, the girl tilted her head and asked, "What's a book?" Maggie said, "It's a place where stories live." The girl thought for a moment, then nodded. Before dawn they left quietly. The girl, wrapped in an old blanket, held close, her eyes wide open but unblinking. No one chased them. No one even stirred. But the mountain wasn't done with them. And what followed would prove that in places where no one looks, some of the darkest legacies still breathe. They arrived at the nearest town just after sunrise. The roads were still damp with fog and the first stores hadn't opened yet. Maggie held the girl tightly in her lap, wrapped in the same blanket, while Ethan drove without saying a word. He kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting headlights or shadows to follow them, but the road behind was always empty. The silence inside the car was not peace. It was tension, thick and unreal, the kind of quiet that hangs over a place where something irreversible has just happened. They parked near a small community church. Behind it stood a modest building with blue shutters and a white cross painted above the door. The Haven House, a shelter run by a nun named Sister Anne, whom Maggie had known for years. Sister Anne opened the door, her face calm, but her eyes immediately locked on the girl in Maggie's arms. She didn't ask any questions right away. She just stepped aside and gestured them in. They laid the girl down on a cot in one of the side rooms. She didn't cry. She didn't ask where they were. She simply lay there, her arms crossed stiffly over her chest, as if waiting to be told what to do. Sister Anne brought her a cup of warm milk and a piece of bread. The girl sat up slowly, looked at Maggie and whispered, "Can I?" as if seeking permission just to eat. That simple question pierced Maggie like a blade. The girl wasn't hungry for food, she was hungry for approval. For safety. In the following days, they tried to gather any information they could to begin the process of helping her officially. They needed a birth certificate, any sort of record. But there was nothing. She had no name, no date of birth, no registered parents. She was, in the eyes of the state, a ghost. Maggie suggested using Mary as a placeholder, based on what the girl had been called before, but the girl seemed unsure every time someone used it. Sometimes they say that, she'd mumble. But other times I'm Sarah. Or Ruthie. Ethan suggested they call her what she wanted to be called. When they asked her, she stared out the window for a long time before saying, "Last night I dreamed a man with a white beard said I was light. Like, not heavy. Just, light in the dark." Maggie smiled through tears and said, "Then maybe you're Luz." The girl nodded slowly. From that moment on she was Luz. But naming her was only the beginning. Ethan and Maggie went to the local CPS office to report the situation officially. They brought the photos, Maggie's journal, and the letter. The woman behind the desk raised her eyebrows but remained expressionless. She asked for legal guardianship papers. They had none. She asked for official identification. There was none. "So what you're telling me," the worker said flatly, "is that you removed a minor from her home without parental consent, and now you're asking us to recognize her?" Maggie replied with calm but icy precision. "What I'm telling you is that if we left her there, she'd be dead or worse in a year." The worker leaned back and sighed. "We need more than anecdotes. We need evidence." Defeated but not ready to give up, Ethan contacted Sarah Bloom, a lawyer he had once met during a seminar on child neglect cases. Sarah agreed to meet that same evening. She listened to every word they said, took notes, and reviewed the journal and photos. When she saw the letter, she held it like a fragile artifact. "This isn't just neglect," she said quietly. "This is generational abuse. It's systemic incest. And it's been hidden for decades." But Sarah also knew how the legal system worked. "If we go at this head-on, they'll shut the door. We need to build a case that shows Luz's safety is at risk, that returning her to that environment would be a violation of her basic human rights." She proposed filing for temporary protective custody, citing psychological harm, lack of documentation, and suspected criminal conduct. Meanwhile, she would begin drafting a formal complaint to the Department of Justice and an appeal to child advocacy groups to draw attention. But the fight was only beginning. That night, as Maggie and Ethan were preparing Luz for bed, someone knocked on the door of the shelter. It was a man, tall, unshaven, wearing a faded coat and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He claimed to be Luz's uncle. Said his name was Joel Turner and he had come to take her back. He presented a piece of paper with a barely legible signature and a supposed birth certificate with her name listed as Mary and Turner, sister, and called Maggie and Sarah. When asked to provide the names of Luz's parents, Joel hesitated. "Her mama's name was Ruth, or maybe Ellen," he said, visibly unsure. Sarah stepped forward and asked him to identify the photo Ethan had brought from the mountain. Joel looked at it, then mumbled, "Never seen it before." Sarah quietly called the sheriff. The man was asked to leave and warned not to return without a court order. The next day, the shelter's front gate was found partially pried open. A dead stray dog lay near the side entrance. No note. No signs. But the message was clear. From then on, Sister and instituted night watch rotations. Luz began sleeping with a night light and the crucifix she had carried from the mountain. She no longer spoke unless spoken to. One day she asked Maggie, "If I'm here now, does that mean I don't have to get married?" Maggie choked on her coffee. She sat down next to Luz and told her firmly, "You will never be forced to do anything again." Luz nodded, slowly, but her eyes didn't reflect understanding. Only caution. Sarah finally got a judge to issue an emergency hearing, arguing that Luz had no identity because her identity had been systematically erased. That removing her from the only life she knew wasn't abduction, it was rescue. Maggie and Ethan prepared Luz for the court appearance. The idea of putting her in front of a judge terrified everyone. But there was no other way. Sarah coached her, gently, never pushing, only asking that she answer questions as best she could. On the day of the hearing, Luz wore a plain white dress and clutched her wooden crucifix like a lifeline. The courtroom was quiet, almost reverent as the judge reviewed the file. When asked if she wanted to speak, Luz hesitated. Maggie took her hand and said, "It's okay. Just say what you feel." Luz leaned forward and said in a voice barely audible, "Where I come from, everyone's family. Nobody has names. And sometimes, daddies are also grandpas." The room fell silent. The judge, a man in his 60s with graying temples, looked up from the papers and studied Luz for a long time. He asked no further questions. He simply wrote something down and said, "I'm granting temporary protective custody. This child is not to be returned to any person or place pending further investigation." When they left the courthouse, Ethan whispered to Maggie, "That wasn't just a win. That was a beginning." But none of them realized how far the shadows still reached. In the days that followed, Luz began to draw. At first, her pictures were chaotic. Swirls, black circles, crude shapes. Then came the faces. A woman crying. A man with no mouth. A child holding a doll with broken arms. Sarah handed the drawings to a trauma specialist, who said they were consistent with complex post-traumatic stress. Yet Luz also began to smile, sometimes. She joined the shelter's daily story time, though she didn't speak much. She traced letters slowly with her finger. She began writing her name over and over again. Luz. 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 Meanwhile, Sarah continued compiling the formal complaint. She included Ethan's photographs, Maggie's journal, the letter, the medical findings, and the transcript from court. But she needed more. She needed someone from the system to acknowledge the community's existence. That moment came unexpectedly. A woman named Marlene Watkins, who worked at the local Vital Records office, overheard the case in a staff meeting and contacted Sarah privately. Years ago, she'd seen several birth registrations come through with duplicate signatures and repeating names, children born years apart, always to the same parents. She was told not to ask questions. But she'd kept photocopies. What she had was gold. Forged documents. A pattern. A system. Sarah took it directly to federal authorities. A federal judge reviewed the case and issued a confidential order authorizing a joint investigation with law enforcement and child welfare agents. The mission: locate the remaining children. Confirm their safety. Secure the site before anyone could destroy evidence. Maggie and Ethan weren't allowed to go. But they didn't sleep that night. Luz did though. For the first time in her life, she slept through the night without waking. And deep in the hills of Appalachia, the quiet was breaking. Not in words, but in footsteps. The convoy moved quietly at dawn. Unmarked SUVs, a mobile forensics van, and a single child welfare transport vehicle crawled up the winding roads of eastern Kentucky like a slow-moving shadow. The operation had been planned in secrecy. No press. No local police. Only federal agents, 2 forensic anthropologists, 3 CPS field investigators, and a federal observer. The location was logged with GPS pins based on Ethan's earlier coordinates, but the actual path up the ridge remained treacherous and overgrown. It was like the land itself was trying to hide what lived there. Back at the Haven house, Maggie and Ethan waited in silence. Luz was in the chapel with Sister Anne, tracing the letters of her name on a chalkboard, whispering them to herself like a spell. The shelter had reinforced locks now, security cameras, even motion-activated lights. But fear still leaked through the windows. Ever since the man who claimed to be Luz's uncle had shown up, strange things had begun to happen. Scratched messages on the door, a child's doll left on the porch with its head missing, a dead crow nailed to the mailbox. The message was clear: we're watching. But that morning, Maggie focused only on the time. Every hour that passed without a call was both a relief and a strain. Ethan paced like a caged animal, eyes flicking to his phone every few minutes. When the call finally came, it was Sarah. Her voice was low, tired, and heavy. "They're gone," she said. Ethan froze. "Gone how?" "The houses are there but empty. Abandoned. Just like that. Food left on tables. Bed still warm. But not a soul in sight." A stillness settled in the room. Maggie sat down, her hands resting on the pages of her worn-out journal. "They knew we were coming." Sarah confirmed it. "Someone tipped them off. Maybe someone local. Maybe someone within the system. We don't know yet. But they vanished." The agents had found remnants. In one of the houses, a small stuffed bear was sitting upright in a corner. In another, a drawing etched into the floorboards with a dull blade. A house with no windows and a figure inside, crying. In the back of what used to be the largest structure, there was a pit freshly filled with dirt and covered in pine branches. Forensic teams would need days to process it. But there were no people. No children. No adults. Not even footprints leading away. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. That night, Maggie cried in silence. Not for herself, not for Ethan, not even for Luz. She cried for the others, the ones left behind, the ones still hiding, the ones too broken to know they needed saving. She cried for the silence. And the cruelty of how quickly truth can disappear. The following week, the investigation expanded. Federal authorities began to cross-reference the forged birth records Marlene Watkins had uncovered. What emerged was a chilling pattern. Names repeated over decades, slight spelling variations, children registered in the same location under different parents but with identical handwriting on the forms. There were over 20 such entries spanning a period of 40 years. Some of the names matched no existing school, clinic, or census record. More troubling were the notes scribbled in the margins of some documents: "Do not pursue," "handled," or just the initials WBR, which no one could yet decode. Sarah took this evidence to the Department of Health and Human Services, urging them to recognize the case as systemic abuse rooted in institutional negligence. But red tape began to wrap around the case like vines. Meetings were postponed. Requests were denied. A quiet pressure was mounting, from where no one could tell. But someone somewhere wanted the story to die. Ethan, exhausted and furious, wanted to go back up the ridge himself. Maggie tried to stop him. Said it was too dangerous. But he needed to see. To prove, even if just to himself, that it wasn't a dream. He took a discreet route, avoiding main roads, bringing only a small pack, a satellite phone, and a camera. He reached the clearing by foot. The air was cold and damp. The silence was thicker than before. Trees had been chopped down and scattered to block certain paths. A few houses remained standing, though stripped of anything personal. He entered the house where he'd first seen Luz. The room was mostly empty. But on one wall, in faint, childlike handwriting, were the words, "Don't forget us." Outside, behind one of the houses, a pile of burned paper and cloth had mostly turned to ash. But Ethan found something half buried in the dirt nearby. A photograph, blackened at the edges but still legible. It showed 3 children standing in front of a shed. One of them looked just like Luz. The photo was dated in blue ink, 2014. Ethan returned the next day and handed everything to Sarah, who added it to the case file. But time was running out. The public still knew nothing. No media coverage. No inquiries. The government agencies involved were starting to lose interest. No bodies. No suspects. No names. But Luz was still there. And she was changing. At night, she no longer asked if she'd have to go back. She began to draw new things: houses with open doors, windows with light. She learned to say, "My name is Luz," with her chin high. She asked Maggie if people like her could become teachers. Maggie told her yes. Told her that names are not given, they are chosen, earned, and protected. One afternoon, Luz drew something she had never drawn before. A girl standing on a hill, arms stretched toward the sky, a sun rising behind her. Maggie asked who it was. Luz replied, "That's me. When I grow." Sarah knew they needed to act before the case slipped into bureaucratic limbo. She partnered with a non-profit legal advocacy group and filed a motion for permanent guardianship on behalf of Luz, as well as a federal petition to investigate the named region under child endangerment and trafficking statutes. The word trafficking raised flags and attention. Suddenly, the story became harder to bury. A journalist from an independent investigative news outlet contacted Sarah. She wanted to write about Luz's case. Sarah was reluctant at first. She didn't want Luz exposed. But the journalist promised anonymity and consent. Maggie and Ethan discussed it with Luz, explaining what it meant to share her story. Luz asked only one thing: "Can I choose what name you use?" They said yes. She chose Luma. She said she had dreamed it again, this time carved in light on a stone. "It's like Luz but more mine," she explained. The article came out 2 weeks later. It was titled, "The Children of the Forgotten Hollow." It spoke of intergenerational abuse, of silence as a weapon, of how isolation can mutate love into control. It didn't mention locations or names. But it shook readers. The story went viral on advocacy networks, forums, and eventually hit national outlets. And then came the backlash. Accusations of exaggeration. Think pieces accusing the article of exploiting rural poverty. Letters to the editor demanding retractions. Even local officials from counties near the region denied everything. Said there was no evidence. No such community. Just urban fear-mongering. But those who knew, they knew. And in the midst of the noise, Luz kept growing. She could now read simple sentences. She began leading story time at the shelter for the younger kids. She painted a mural on the side of the chapel. A house with many windows and a path leading away from it covered in stars. One night, Maggie found her outside staring at the sky. She asked what Luz was thinking. Luz replied, "If the others are still up there, maybe they'll see the stars and follow." Maggie didn't answer. She just sat beside her and looked up too. But in the weeks that followed, someone began leaving signs again. Scratches on the shelter's gate. A child's shoe. A sliver of wood with the word return carved into it. Sarah knew what it meant. Someone hadn't forgotten. Someone wanted Luz back. Or wanted her to disappear. That's when they decided to move her. sister and arranged for a transfer to a shelter in another state, under a protected child identity program. Luz would be given new documents, a new school, a new therapist. Maggie would visit weekly. Ethan monthly. Sarah would oversee the legal continuation. But nothing would erase what had been. And far away, in the stillness of a hollow carved into the spine of Appalachia, eyes were still watching. They moved her quietly. No formal goodbyes. No ceremony. Just a rainy Tuesday morning and a black SUV with tinted windows waiting at the back entrance of the shelter. Luz wore a blue hoodie 3 sizes too big and carried her favorite notebook and a small wooden cross on a string. Maggie packed a sealed envelope with her drawings, therapy records, and the court documents that named her a ward of the state, under the name she had chosen, Luma Everly. A name that was hers, untouched by the bloodlines and whispers of the hollow where she had come from. The new shelter was over 200 miles away, in a county where no one asked questions and everyone understood what protective transfer really meant. It was run by a soft-spoken woman named Janice Moore, a retired school counselor who had turned her family farm into a licensed refuge for girls who had survived the unthinkable. The house sat on a hill with wind chimes on the porch and sunflowers leaning against the fence. It was nothing like what Luz had ever known. Her first night there she didn't speak. She didn't eat. She stared at the ceiling as if waiting for the roof to fall. Janice didn't push. She simply left a lamp on and a book beside the bed, The Secret Garden. In the morning Luz hadn't opened it, but she had placed her cross inside as a bookmark. That was something. Back in Kentucky things were changing, subtly but fast. After the viral article, an anonymous whistleblower inside the Department of Child Welfare leaked internal memos indicating that reports of intergenerational incest and isolation in undocumented mountain settlements had existed for years but were repeatedly flagged as low priority due to logistical constraints and lack of jurisdiction. Sarah obtained a copy and submitted it as part of her expanding legal portfolio, now over 600 pages. Meanwhile, Maggie began getting strange calls at night. No voice. Just breathing. Once at 3:47 a.m., her phone rang and a child's voice said, "She's not yours." Then the line went dead. Ethan received a photo in the mail with no return address. An image of the empty house where Luz had once lived, taken from the woods. On the back, written in faint pencil, "We remember who belongs." They filed police reports. Nothing came of it. Then came the worst of it. One morning, a man appeared at the old shelter gate. He was tall, wearing a dark green jacket and work boots caked in red clay. His beard was short, face gaunt, and he carried a folder under one arm. He introduced himself as Marshall Rhodes, legal representative of a man named Ellis Turner, who he claimed was Luz's biological grandfather and legal guardian. He demanded immediate visitation rights and accused the shelter of illegal removal of a minor. When Sister Ann asked for proof of identity, he presented a freshly issued birth certificate, filed less than a month ago, with Luz's birth name listed as Mary Ruth Turner, born to Ruth Ellen Turner and James Ellis Turner. The names were familiar. They matched fragments from Maggie's journal. Sarah immediately called foul. That certificate's a forgery. They're building a paper trail from shadows. But the local family court accepted the petition for review. A judge scheduled a hearing to determine whether the guardianship awarded to the state could be overturned if biological ties could be proven. Sarah knew it was a trap. It wasn't about getting Luz back. It was about exposing where she'd been moved. So they did something drastic. They went public, again. This time with Luz's consent, and with every safeguard possible, Sarah, Maggie, and Ethan collaborated with the journalist who had first covered the story. They recorded a private interview with Luz, blurred her face, altered her voice. She read a statement she'd written by hand. It said, "Where I came from, everyone said they loved me but they didn't let me say no. They gave me many names but none of them were mine. I'm not their daughter. I'm not their niece. I'm not their wife. My name is Luma. I chose it. And I don't want to go back." The clip aired on a national podcast focused on survivors of institutional abuse. It spread fast. The next morning, the hashtag her name is Luma trended on social media. Public defenders, trauma therapists, and child protection advocates rallied in support. Some called for congressional inquiry into rural child neglect. Others demanded the revocation of custody claims tied to historically isolated communities. But it also brought danger. The shelter where Luz was now staying received 3 threatening letters in a week. One said, "She's cursed the bloodline." Another read simply, "Return what's ours." Then, someone cut the shelter's power line in the middle of the night. The children had to be relocated temporarily to a nearby church hall. Luz didn't cry, but she asked Janice if the darkness would ever stop coming. Janice told her the truth: it doesn't. But we learn how to carry our own light. Meanwhile, Sarah filed for an injunction to permanently sever any parental or familial claims to Luz. She included audio recordings of the threats, the falsified documents, the historical patterns from forged records, and expert psychological evaluations from Dr. Leah Forrester, who had worked with Luz weekly since her transfer. Dr. Forrester's report was clinical but devastating. It detailed complex trauma symptoms, identity confusion caused by intergenerational role displacement, and sexual boundaries violated before the age of memory. She concluded that returning Luz to any person associated with her origin environment would be a form of institutional complicity in ongoing abuse. The court battle that followed wasn't televised, but it felt cinematic. Marshall Rhodes came armed with documentation, photos of cabins, affidavits from alleged relatives, claiming they were just a misunderstood community. He called it homesteading culture. He accused the state of colonial aggression, and claimed that Luz had been indoctrinated into shame. Sarah dismantled it methodically. She produced linguistic analysis of statements made by supposed relatives showing suggestive coercion patterns. She brought forward a forensic linguist who testified that the letters included phrase constructions consistent with grooming language. She introduced the birth registration expert who confirmed that Luz's name had never existed in any census, school, or hospital record prior to her extraction. Then Sarah asked to play a video. It was Luz, blurred, distorted voice, reading her own words. I was born twice. Once in the dark. And once when someone asked me what I wanted to be called. Silence fell over the courtroom. The judge, an older woman with years in family court, tapped her pen twice on the bench before delivering her ruling. This child is not property. She is not heritage. She is not owed to anyone by blood. She is Luma Everly by her own name and choice. And this court grants her full permanent protective status. There was no applause. No celebration. Just exhale. But what they didn't know was that while one door had been closed, others were opening elsewhere. In the weeks following the court's decision, Sarah's office was broken into. Files were rifled through. Nothing was stolen, but someone had clearly been searching. Ethan's truck was vandalized, windshield smashed, tires slashed. Maggie received an envelope with no return address containing a copy of her original notes, the ones she had thought were locked in her private file cabinet, with the words "Not Your Story" scrawled across the cover. Still they kept going. They created a foundation under Luma's name dedicated to uncovering unregistered settlements and patterns of institutional incest. Therapists began using anonymized versions of her drawings in trauma education. Lawmakers started drafting new language for federal protection guidelines for children found in extra-institutional communities. Luma, now living under complete anonymity, was enrolled in a private alternative school. Her therapist said she was slowly beginning to form friendships, engage in games and respond to laughter without flinching. She had developed a new hobby, origami. She folded hundreds of tiny paper stars and kept them in a glass jar by her bed. She said each one was a word she hadn't yet spoken. One evening Maggie visited her, bringing new books and a lavender-scented pillow. Luma sat beside her, then whispered, "I want to be someone who helps people escape." Maggie asked, "Escape from what?" Luma said, "From names they didn't choose." And just like that, the story shifted, from survival to purpose. But the mountain wasn't silent yet. In a remote stretch of woodland, 3 hikers discovered a cabin buried beneath overgrowth. Inside were photographs, names carved into the wall. A bed with restraints. A crude map showing trails branching out like spider legs from a single marked point labeled home. Law enforcement was called. Sarah was notified. Maggie's heart clenched. Because the story of Luz, of Luma, was not isolated. It was a window. And behind it, the shadows were still moving. The discovery of the cabin changed everything. Up until then, the fight for Luma had been framed as extraordinary, an isolated miracle pulled from the depths of silence. But that windowless room in the woods, lined with restraints and yellowed photos, proved that her case was not a rare accident. It was a symptom. A branch of something older, darker, and far more entrenched than anyone wanted to admit. The hikers who found the place were a couple from Knoxville and their friend from North Carolina, weekend campers following an outdated trail map they'd printed off an amateur blog. They were looking for waterfalls. Instead, they found what looked like a ruin swallowed by vines. Inside, they found mattresses covered in mildew, a bucket of used razors, A wall where names were scratched in overlapping rows, some crossed out, others etched deeper like someone wanted them to last forever. At the far end, pinned to the inside of a cabinet door, was a photograph of a girl. Ethan recognized her immediately when the federal agents called. It was one of the children he'd seen during his first visit to the Hollow. Her name was never known, but her eyes told the same story Luma had once carried. The location was roughly 30 miles from the original settlement. Close enough to suggest it was part of the same network, whatever that meant. But no paths led in or out. It had been hidden with care. Federal forensic teams spent 3 days collecting samples, mapping the area and extracting fibers. DNA was sent for comparison. The structure had no power, no plumbing, no signs of recent occupancy, yet there were small footprints in the dust, a half-eaten apple, a child's plastic cup on the floor. Someone had been there recently. The federal task force handling Luma's case reopened their files under a broader designation, Potential Multi-Generational Containment Network. Sarah had never heard of the term before. It was new. Invented, maybe because no agency had ever truly considered the existence of a system where children were born, abused, and erased in full isolation without the oversight, or knowledge, of any state apparatus. At the foundation Sarah, Ethan, and Maggie had started, reports began to trickle in. Emails, letters, anonymous tips. People recalling strange families from their pasts. Neighbors who had children that never went to school, homes where the front porch lights were always off, girls who got pregnant too young and then vanished entirely. A woman from Virginia sent a cassette tape labeled 1978, Pine Hollow, containing a crackling interview between a social worker and a teenage girl who described being shared between the men of her house. The worker on the tape warned her never to repeat that story again. No one had followed up. Sarah started to suspect something she didn't want to name, that the system hadn't just failed kids like Luma, it had quietly stepped back from them. Repeatedly. Meanwhile, Luma continued to grow into her new identity. Her speech had improved. Her handwriting steadied. She joined an art class once a week at a small community center under the alias Ellie. She liked that name. Said it felt safe but not hidden. Her therapist, Dr. Forrester, reported that she was beginning to express personal opinions for the first time. She could now say no, ask questions, even challenge adults gently. She'd once asked Janice if the world ever ran out of words. Janice had smiled and said, "Not if people keep making them up." That afternoon, Luma invented her own word, frithen, which she defined as a feeling of being safe inside your own skin. But the threats hadn't stopped. Ethan's tires were slashed a second time, this time outside the courthouse during a meeting with a judge. Maggie's mailbox was set on fire. Sarah began receiving text messages from encrypted numbers containing only coordinates, places she never went but all of which were marked by past CPS investigations. One text read, "Try to dig here too?" Another simply said, "They're watching you, watch us." Sarah met with a federal liaison from the DOJ. She was blunt. "This is bigger than child welfare. We're dealing with generational crime under the cloak of cultural preservation." The DOJ agent nodded and handed her a sealed folder. It contained internal memos from as far back as 1982 referencing autonomous Appalachian kin groups and advising non-interference due to risk of community destabilization. The word autonomous was used 12 times. Maggie's hands trembled as she read the file. They knew. They knew back then. Ethan, always the most volatile of the three, proposed making a documentary. Not a viral video or a podcast, but a full-length feature. A record. He said it wasn't about justice anymore, it was about memory. About building proof that wouldn't disappear when administrations changed or grants dried up. Sarah agreed on one condition. Luma's identity had to be protected. Always. They interviewed Dr. Forrester, Sister and Janice Moore, and other social workers who had worked near the region over the last 3 decades. Several were reluctant, but once they saw the footage, the house in the woods, the cabin with restraints, Luma's anonymized testimony, they agreed. They spoke of girls named after weather patterns, boys who only answered to brother or pa. They spoke of births that were never recorded and schools that turned a blind eye to who came and went. One teacher from Tennessee described a girl who'd come to her 3rd grade class with bruises, a permanent limp, and no verbal ability beyond 2 words, mine and no. She lasted 3 weeks before being pulled from school. No one saw her again. That was 2009. Ethan edited the first draft of the documentary himself. It was quiet, sparse, mostly voiceovers and still images. It didn't name names. It didn't point fingers. It asked one simple question. What happens when the family is the cage? They submitted the film to independent festivals under the title Everly. It was accepted quietly without fanfare, and shown at a late-night slot in a regional human rights expo. The audience, though small, was stunned. Afterward, a counselor approached Sarah and said she'd worked in a rural district in Kentucky for years. She asked for a private meeting. There, she admitted that 10 years earlier she'd visited a family whose children had overlapping features, speech delays, and a strange way of referring to their elders, using no names, only phrases like the first one, the father, and the blood above. When she flagged it to her superior, she was told it was cultural. She quit 6 months later. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. Luma's case was a fracture in a dam that had held for generations. Not just one family, not just one cabin, but a constellation of silences stitched across backwoods, hollows, and forgotten townships. And then, in early spring, someone broke into the foundation storage unit. They didn't steal money or equipment. They didn't touch the cameras or hard drives. But they took 3 original notebooks, Maggie's field logs from the first visits, including sketches, transcripts, and details never shared publicly. Sarah was livid. This isn't intimidation anymore. It's a cleanup. A week later, a small-town newspaper ran an op-ed denouncing the documentary as an attack on rural independence. The author was a pastor from a community 30 miles south of the original settlement. His final line read, "We don't answer to outsiders. We don't kneel to cameras. And we don't forget what's ours." Maggie's house was tagged that same night. Spray painted across her garage. Her name was never yours to give. They moved her into protective housing. Still, none of them backed down. Because Luma hadn't. She wrote a poem. Her first. There was a girl who had no name. So she took one from the sky. It didn't belong to anyone. So no one could take it back. She wore it like a coat, soft and new. And when they came to steal it, she said, "This one's mine." And she didn't run. She stood still. Dr. Forrester framed the poem and kept it in her office. She said it reminded her that trauma wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was written in the margins, in quiet resistance, in choosing not to flinch. Then came the call. Another child had surfaced. A girl found wandering a rural road in West Virginia, disoriented, shoeless, with mismatched clothes. She didn't speak. Carried no ID. When asked where she came from, she pointed toward the trees and whispered, "The place." Sarah got on a plane the next morning. Because once you know the shadows are real, you can't unsee them. And because Luma had not been the end of the story. She was only the first light in the dark. The girl found on the roadside was estimated to be around 12, though she didn't know her age. Her face was pale from sun exposure, her lips cracked. She had no shoes, no bag, and wore a boy's jacket that hung past her knees. She didn't speak much in the first 48 hours, just mumbled fragments of sentences that didn't quite fit together. "He said don't touch the rope," she whispered once. "The sky told me when to stop." Another time she asked the nurse, "Do I still have to bleed or am I done now?" She had bruises on her wrists and welts healing over her shoulders. A social worker called Sarah immediately after examining the girl's responses during intake. When Sarah arrived, she found her sitting cross-legged on a hospital bed, clutching a small plastic spoon. The girl turned to her and said, "Did you bring the name yet?" Sarah sat beside her and asked gently, "What name would you like?" The girl looked out the window for a long time before answering, "Something that isn't anyone else's." The case was painfully familiar. Another child born and raised in isolation. Another voice swallowed by a system that didn't know how to see what it wasn't trained to look for. The girl didn't have a name, a school record, or even proof she existed. But she had one thing, a memory of a story she'd heard in the woods. There was a girl who got out, she said. They said she chose the sun. That she left her skin behind and walked away new. Sarah asked, "Do you remember her name?" The girl nodded. Luma. That one word changed the trajectory of everything. They hadn't expected the stories to spread. Hadn't imagined that word of a girl choosing her name would pass in whispers through communities that weren't supposed to have radios, internet, or even written records. But it had. Somehow, the name had become a myth, a symbol, a flicker of possibility in the darkness. And now more were beginning to surface. In the months that followed, 4 more children were found. All of them malnourished, unregistered, and unable to explain where they'd come from except with phrases like, the mountain, the rooms, and before the counting. None of them could read. All of them had the same hollow, searching look that Sarah now recognized on sight. Luma, now 13, was told the truth. That others like her were being found. That her story had helped guide them out. Her first reaction wasn't joy. It was fear. "They'll come for me now," she said. "They'll want me to stop talking." But when Janice asked her what she wanted to do, Luma said, "Keep going. If I stop, they win." She began writing letters, not to the children but to the adults who had hurt them. She wrote one to the man with the book, another to the lady who named everyone. They were never sent, but Dr. Forrester encouraged her to read them aloud in sessions. One began, "I know what you did wasn't love. I know because now I've seen love, and it doesn't feel like obeying. It feels like being allowed to say no." The documentary Everly was picked up by a streaming platform. It was quietly released without press or trailers, tucked between larger titles. But word spread. Survivor networks shared it. Educators used it. Lawmakers watched in closed-door meetings. For the first time, there was public conversation not just about abuse, but about communities so far removed from the system they could grow entire generations without interruption. Not by magic or conspiracy, but by apathy, geography, and fear. The foundation received new funding. A mobile response team was created to investigate unincorporated settlements. Therapists and educators began training to recognize signs of multigenerational entrapment. Policies were quietly rewritten to close gaps in child documentation oversight. But the most important change didn't come from a policy or a grant. It came from a classroom. Luma was now attending a private school under protective status, where none of the other students knew her past. She was quiet but steady. She drew often, wrote more. She kept a journal filled with invented words. Frithen, Malawin, Drinta. Words that had no translation, but she always smiled when she said them. One day her teacher gave the class an assignment. Write a letter to your past self. Luma's letter read, "Dear girl with no name, you are not a shadow. You are not the silence. You are the echo that survived it. You will learn words and some of them will hurt, but others will make you whole. You will not be what they said you were. You will be the first voice, not the last. And someday someone will call you by the name you chose. And it will feel like coming home." She shared it at the end of the year assembly. No one clapped right away. There was a moment of stillness where everyone just sat, processing, realizing. Then the room erupted. And far away, on a ridge scarred by decades of silence, the wind moved through the trees in a way that felt like something loosening. Today, Luma volunteers at the foundation that bears her name. She reads stories to children just beginning their healing. She never uses her real name in public. She doesn't have to. They call her the girl who chose the sun. And that's enough. This is not a happy ending. Because endings like this don't tie in neat bows. There are still places where the silence rules, where names are borrowed and bodies are bartered and the world doesn't look in. But there are fewer now. And there are more who know how to listen. Because one girl chose to say no. One girl chose to become light. If this story moved you, if you felt anger, grief, hope, or something you can't name, please subscribe to this channel. Not for me. For the ones who still live in the shadows. For the ones who haven't yet found the path out. Share this story. Talk about it. Ask questions. Don't let the silence win. This is Deep American Shadows and I'm Berg. Thank you for not looking away.